Hi, and welcome to today's national call on coronavirus disasters, housing, and homelessness. This is Sarah Savian. I'm Vice President of Public Policy at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're going to give it a moment or so for people to join on the line, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, let's get started. As I mentioned, I'm Sarah Savian. I'm Vice President of Public Policy for the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, and this is our weekly national call on coronavirus, disasters, housing, and homelessness. I'm filling in for our CEO, Diane Yantel, who was pulled away at the last moment, but we have a really great call today, and I'm so glad that you're able to join us. On our call, we have homeless service providers, housing providers, advocacy organizations, people experiencing homelessness, and low-income renters. We also have media, congressional staff, and philanthropy on the line. During today's call, we're going to get an update about how the CDC eviction moratorium is working, as well as learn more about a new report that NLIHC published last week on some of the challenges and best practices from FEMA's efforts to house people experiencing homelessness in hotels and motels during the pandemic. That report was written with direct input from many of the organizations on this call and who participate in our working group. We'll also get field updates from Georgia and Illinois and hear the latest on what's happening in Congress with a pandemic relief bill, with spending bills, and we just learned a bill that will be voted on the House floor tomorrow that will make really important reforms to FEMA and how they serve low-income disaster survivors, and to reduce the state and local match that is required for many FEMA programs during this pandemic. A key piece of our call is going to be talking about how advocates can restart their advocacy efforts in their efforts to reach out to their senators and representatives and to urge. We're seeing that Congress is restarting negotiations, and so this is a really important time for all of you on the call to get engaged again. And so we're encouraging folks to save the date for a national call-in day that you'll learn more about. That will be on Thursday, November 19th, which is this Thursday. We have a small window of opportunity to make sure that Congress reaches a deal in the lame duck to pass a COVID relief package. It's unclear what the size of that package will be, and we really need to make sure that housing advocates are fighting to keep rental assistance and other essential housing and homelessness resources in that package. We know that the consequences are dire. Up to 30 to 40 million renters are at risk of losing their homes by the end of the year, and we have a lot of work to do. So we're going to go ahead and get started on our call. Our first speaker today is Peter Hepburn with Rutgers University and the Eviction Lab, who's going to share the latest on how the CDC eviction moratorium is working. Peter, go ahead. Peter, we can't hear you. Maybe you want to try unmuting your line. And while Peter is unmuting himself, I'll just remind folks that you can ask questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and we'll try to make sure that we can get to it.
Sorry about that. So I don't seem to have control of the screen anymore.
Maybe Tori or May can help with that, bringing up the slides.
And I'm a policy analyst with the coalition. So as Sarah mentioned, I'll be providing a brief overview of a new NLIHC report that we released last week on using FEMA Public Assistance funds to house people experiencing homelessness in non-congregate shelters like hotels and motels during the pandemic. And I just put a link to the report in the chat box. So the report identifies best practices, lessons learned, and challenges homeless service providers and community leaders face when using FEMA funds to house people experiencing homelessness in hotels and motels. It also highlights success stories and opportunities to apply lessons learned to a future pandemic or the next wave of this one, and provides policy recommendations to reform FEMA programs to house people experiencing homelessness in non-congregate shelters. So as we all know, and the pandemic has made abundantly clear, housing is healthcare. People experiencing homelessness are highly vulnerable to contracting and spreading the virus, and people with disabilities who live in congregate settings have suffered high rates of severe illness and death. So despite the need after past disasters, FEMA generally does not provide public assistance funding for emergency sheltering in non-congregate settings. However, given the strain on the current homeless shelter system as a result of the pandemic, FEMA determined that certain non-congregate sheltering costs will be reimbursable under its public assistance program, which allowed state and local officials to request reimbursement for moving people experiencing homelessness to non-congregate settings where they can safely isolate and quarantine. And throughout the pandemic, we've seen homeless service providers and community leaders work tirelessly to use FEMA PA funds to keep people experiencing homelessness safe. So what we did is we reached out to partners across the country, like Sarah said, many of you on this call, to learn about state and local efforts to use FEMA funds for this purpose. We sought to identify and analyze the challenges that officials and service providers face, as well as the strategies they use to overcome these challenges. And while some of the issues raised by our partners mirror persistent barriers to using FEMA resources that we've seen in past disasters, others reflect new challenges stemming from the unprecedented nature of using FEMA funds for this purpose. Our hope is that the lessons learned from this experience can be applied to future efforts to address the housing and health needs of people experiencing homelessness and others living in congregate settings, such as people with disabilities. So our partners identified challenges related to eligibility criteria, FEMA's lack of clear guidance and transparency, the federal cost share requirement, and local coordination and capacity issues. They also reported hurdles related to hotel negotiations, resistance from community members and local officials, and transitioning hotel guests to permanent housing solutions. And as with other disasters, the federal response to the pandemic has underscored deep inequities in our disaster housing response and recovery system. So while I won't have time to address every challenge we identified in the report, I do want to highlight several on today's call. So first, in our research and conversation with partners, we learned that a lack of clear guidance and transparency from FEMA hindered some efforts to use PA funds. FEMA often refrains from accepting extension requests until the very last moment, creating confusion and concern among state and local officials that the agency will abruptly stop reimbursing the hotel rooms. This uncertainty around reimbursement caused officials in LA County, Orange County, and San Francisco to start winding down their hotel programs before they had the opportunity to move residents into permanent housing. And while jurisdictions across the US are developing plans to transition people temporarily residing in FEMA-funded hotels into permanent housing, the shortage of affordable, accessible, and available homes to the lowest income renters is hindering these efforts. So in our report, we urge greater clarity and transparency from FEMA regarding program guidelines and all materials related to state reimbursements, including information such as expiration dates and eligibility criteria. We also recommend that FEMA activate its wide range of disaster assistance programs, including DHAP, the Disaster Housing Assistance Program, which plays a critical role in providing safe, decent, and affordable homes to individuals with the greatest needs after a disaster. We feel DHAP could be used to help transition individuals into permanent housing solutions rather than allowing them to be pushed back into homelessness when these FEMA-funded hotel programs end. We also learned that complicated hotel negotiation processes and reluctant property owners hindered some efforts to move eligible individuals into safe, non-congregate settings. Resistance from local officials and community members also stymied projects, slowing down and even dismantling some hotel programs. NIMBYs in cities across the country opposed hotel programs, citing concerns, which to be clear are rooted in racist and classist stereotypes about how these programs would adversely impact their communities. So our report spotlights how New York City advocates, including Legal Aid Society, combated this resistance, these vocal NIMBY voices that were urging Mayor Bill de Blasio and other officials to prematurely move people temporarily residing in hotels back to congregate settings. Legal Aid worked with individuals and groups to counter false claims about the hotel guests and to spread awareness of the program's critical public health aspect. The organization also announced it was preparing a lawsuit against the city's plans to force individuals with disabilities from accessible hotels and shelters to other facilities that lack the necessary services to accommodate their needs. According to advocates, the PR campaign has been particularly effective in building community support for the programs. A report also calls attention to how the COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating pre-existing racial inequities entrenched in our housing, healthcare, and economic systems. And as with other disasters, the federal response to the pandemic has underscored the urgent need to reform federal disaster recovery efforts to be inclusive and intersectional, and to ensure that federal disaster recovery resources reach all impacted households. So we learned that in Los Angeles, the availability of hotel rooms for people experiencing homelessness was not evenly distributed. Less affluent areas with predominantly Black and Latino populations and high rates of coronavirus had fewer hotels available than whiter, wealthier cities. So we urge Congress to center racial equity when making the investments and systemic reforms needed to address both the short and long-term impacts of the coronavirus. So while many homeless service providers and communities did face challenges in using FEMA PA funds for this purpose, they have also demonstrated that it is possible to quickly act to keep people experiencing homelessness and others in congregate settings safe during a public health emergency. This was an unprecedented undertaking, and we believe that there are real opportunities to build on the lessons learned from the pandemic and better prepare for future disasters. So I'll stop there for now, but of course I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely, Elena. And I'm going to remind people that if they could just enter their questions into the Q&A box, that'd be very helpful. I also want to say this is an incredibly helpful resource for folks that are working on this issue. I encourage you guys to take a look at it and see, as we're preparing for winter and we're expecting more strain on homeless service providers, to take a look at this report to see what are some best practices that you can incorporate into your work. I'll also say that this is a work in progress. So our intention here is to continue to collect information about challenges and about strategies that communities have used to overcome those challenges. So as you're experiencing more of those, if you feel free to reach out to Elena or other folks on our staff, and we'll add them into the report as we go along. I do have a question. So I know that there were several challenges during the life cycle of these FEMA PA programs. From your perspective, Elena, what is the most critical challenge that's happening right now for communities and for people experiencing homelessness?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I do think one of the major challenges is the fact that a lot of these hotel programs are being forced to shut down before the opportunity to move all of the hotel residents into permanent housing. This is concerning, especially as you said, with winter quickly approaching, and not having the opportunity to move everyone into permanent housing solutions. So we're very concerned about that. And making sure that there are options before these FEMA PA, FEMA stops reimbursing for the hotel rooms, which is why we do feel that DHAP the disaster housing assistance program would be a great option to ensure that, we're taking care and transitioning folks to permanent housing solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really struck by the fact that, FEMA's foundational framework is getting communities and people back to where they were prior to a disaster. And in this context, that means not necessarily helping people transition into permanent housing. Can you say a little bit more about, are there communities that are working to transition people to permanent housing, and how would DHAP work?
Definitely. So as probably many people have heard about Project Home Key in California. That's the next phase of California's program after Project Room Key. Now it's Project Home Key. And so that is the efforts. Counties are partnering with the state to acquire and rehabilitate hotels, motels, and other housing types to convert that into permanent housing. So that's happening, and it is happening elsewhere too. I think that's one of the examples that we hear a lot right now. And so DHAP would be, Democrat and Republican administrations have recognized it as a best practice for disaster housing recovery, and and we've asked them to activate it after recent disasters, but they have yet to do so. And so what DHAP does is it provides safe, decent, affordable homes to individuals after disaster, while also providing wraparound services and helping people get access to permanent housing solutions. So we feel that would be a great option to keep everybody safe and housed while figuring out longer term permanent housing.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Elena. If you can continue to watch the chat box, maybe share another copy of a link to the report. And if you're able to answer questions that people might have, we'd appreciate that.
That's great. Thank you.
Great. Okay, next we're going to turn to our field updates, and we're going to hear first from Bambi Hayes-Brown, who's with Georgia ACT. Bambi, can you hear us?
Yes, I sure can. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm Bambi Hayes-Brown, President and CEO of Georgia Advancing Communities Together. And I'm going to talk briefly about our voter engagement work for Our Homes, Our Votes 2020. Back in November 2019, we were awarded a grant from Our Homes, Our Votes to conduct voter engagement in Georgia. We partner with numerous groups throughout the state of Georgia, urban, suburban, and rural organizations, including NAACP branches, fraternity and sorority organizations, HUD-approved housing counseling agencies, municipal governments, and most of our municipal government partners were rural. We also worked in conjunction with the census. We also hired a social media coordinator to conduct voter engagement via social media. So we did several activities in conjunction with our partners. We had numerous virtual candidate forums because we had intended to do a lot of these things in person, but due to COVID, we had to pivot, and we had to pivot very quickly. So our candidates forums that we had anticipated to do in person, we did those virtual. We also did get out to vote rallies throughout the state, of course, with being socially distant and making sure that Georgia ACT staff and our partners had appropriate PPE. We also did presentations during homebuyer education workshops with our HUD-approved housing counseling partners to come in and talk about Our Homes, Our Votes and voter engagements, because we want to make sure if people purchased a home, then they knew to update their voter registration with their new address. We also did various voter engagement drives, including one of the what I would say very unique things that we did in partnership with the Gwinnett, DeKalb, and Clayton County NAACP branches was hold voter registration in the drive-through line at McDonald's. So that was a great, I would say, private partnership with a corporate entity at McDonald's. We also had 2 billboards that were placed in Southeast Georgia with the new Rho Omega chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority and the Bryan County branch NAACP. So this is in a rural area, and these billboards were along I-95 South. So that gave us some great visibility along a very busy interstate where people were traveling. We also provided snacks and food for people who were in line to vote. This was done in rural South Georgia. This was done in middle Georgia, as well as our urban communities here in Metro Atlanta. And we also provided food for poll workers as well, because we see now how important our poll workers are, especially with Georgia having to do the recount for the presidential race, and also providing rides to the polls for people in our suburban communities and also in our rural communities, because oftentimes in our rural communities there's only one precinct in the entire area, and a person would need to drive sometimes upward of 15 and 20 miles to get to a voter precinct. And keep in mind that in most of those rural communities, there is no public transportation. So we partnered with local churches and also provided them with disinfectant and masks in order to get people to the polls. So people actually had to call to make a reservation to make sure that that the riders were socially distant. And I will also say, just very briefly, going forward, we are looking at activities going forward for the Georgia U.S. Senate runoff that will be on January the 5th, 2021, with early voting beginning on next month. There's still time for people to register to vote, especially those people who are 17 and a half and will be turning 18 before the last day of voting in January. So we are working with a coalition. This is a coalition of several organizations throughout the state of Georgia and registering people who have not voted and people who need to register to vote or have not registered before in the past. We're also looking at working with those individuals, those young people who may be in the juvenile justice system who are still eligible to vote, and also those people who are currently incarcerated and may be waiting on their court dates, because those people are also eligible to vote. I know one of our partners, the DeKalb NAACP, was very instrumental in working with the sheriff under the old administration. They just elected a new sheriff to work with those who are currently incarcerated with getting them registered to vote as well as to vote. And so I will be glad to answer any questions that you may have, but I just wanted to give you those updates when we're talking about voter registration, to really think outside of the box and look at not only our housing partners, including those partners and getting those lists from apartment communities who don't have people registered to vote, and getting those lists and encouraging those individuals to register to vote and also to vote. And so I will stop there and entertain any questions that you may have.
Yes, thank you, Bambi. I'm seeing a lot of comments in the Q&A box and in the chat box. One, I think everybody is congratulating you on a job well done. Some folks had questions about, were these efforts for the entire state of Georgia, or you only focused in some parts of Georgia? And do you have a sense of how many people you reached through your efforts?
We reached, we're getting in all of those final reports now, but it's definitely in the thousands. And I want to be clear that it was definitely a statewide effort. And I cannot stress that enough. And I was very intentional when we started our voter engagement back in November 2019, not to just focus on Atlanta, because I knew that there were so many groups that were going to be working in Atlanta in those urban communities, that I really wanted to concentrate more of our efforts in the suburban communities, as well as in the middle Georgia and those rural Georgia efforts. And so I think that was, very important to make sure that people knew, because we wanted to engage those people in the rural areas because their vote counts too. So I'll be glad to answer any other questions.
Yeah, and it seems like you've made a big difference there too. I'm getting a lot of questions from folks who want to know, for people who are outside of Georgia, how can they be helping your work? How can they be making donations to support your work?
Yes, I will be glad to put our information in the chat. You can also visit us on the web at www.georgiaact.org. Again, www.georgiaact.org. And we were primarily focused on renters for this campaign, because according to, of course, we use a lot of the National Low Income Housing Coalition stats, and more people who are homeowners tend to vote than renters. So we were really focusing our efforts on renters.
Excellent. And I do see another question. I think a lot of people are impressed by the creative partnerships that you created in this campaign. Do you have that information on your website about some online description about the work that you did so that other people can look at it as best practices for their states?
Not yet, but that will definitely be coming within probably within the next 15 days or so, after the holidays, because we are compiling all of these reports, because of course we have to give a final report to the National Low Income Housing Coalition. But we will definitely, and I'll put my information in the chat. I think you have my email address there, but anyone can email me, because we are already started looking forward to our upcoming elections. So we have our governor's election that is coming up, that we know that was very contentious 2 years ago. So we want to make sure that we go ahead and get started on that work as well, because with voter engagement, it is 365, 24/7. So we don't need to just only focus on those major presidential elections, which of course we know that is important, in Senate elections, but we also have to make note that our local elections are extremely important as well.
Absolutely. I'm seeing so many people who are applauding your great work, and thanking you for registering so many people to vote. So thank you so much for joining with us, and hopefully other states will follow your lead.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Absolutely. Our next field update comes from Illinois, from Bob Palmer from Housing Action Illinois. Bob?
Hi, Sarah, and everyone else. Again, I'm Bob Palmer. I'm the Policy Director at Housing Action Illinois. I'm just going to give an update on COVID-19 in Illinois, and specifically our eviction and rent assistance work. Like much of the rest of the country, we're having a very troubling and devastating resurgence of COVID-19 positive cases, and particularly hospitalizations. Just a couple days ago, the mayor of Chicago, Lori Lightfoot, instituted not a stay-at-home order, but a strong stay-at-home advisory for the next couple of weeks. And our governor in Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, has said that if trends continue, he might very well be re-implementing the statewide stay-at-home order that we had earlier this year. In terms of our housing advocacy, we were very fortunate earlier in the year, when our General Assembly met at the end of May, that they did commit, compared to other states, a very large amount of dollars from the CARES Act and the Federal Coronavirus Relief Fund for rent and mortgage assistance, specifically $150 million. for rent assistance and $150 for mortgage assistance that our state housing finance authority, the Illinois Housing Development Authority, started to make available in August. And as won't be a surprise to anyone on this call, even though that was a very significant amount of funds, it didn't come anywhere close to meeting the need. Through the state rental assistance funds, about $150 million again, that was able to assist about 30,000 households. Most all those funds have been dispersed, but more than 80,000 renter households completed an application, and that doesn't include a number that we're still trying to figure out of tenants who needed rent assistance, but their landlord didn't complete their part of the application. There was also a very significant response and need for the mortgage assistance dollars, but not quite as much as for renters. And that was able to assist about 10,000 households, and they had about 20,000 households apply. We've also been very glad that we have continued to have a statewide eviction moratorium, actually till just over the weekend. We still do have a statewide moratorium. The previous moratorium was just really a blanket moratorium with some exceptions for tenants who were posing health or safety risk. Through a revised eviction or executive order that Governor Pritzker put in place over the weekend, it's much more like the federal CDC moratorium, with some significant changes and things that make it stronger. One is that before providing an eviction notice to a tenant, the landlord or property owner does have to provide a copy of the blank declaration form to their tenant, letting them know that if they fill this out and they meet the income requirements and other requirements that are pretty much exactly like the CDC moratorium, and return that to the landlord, then the landlord cannot move forward on the eviction and the other protections in the CDC moratorium. So even if the landlord, even if the tenant doesn't return it right then and there, they can still submit it prior to the eviction being completed. We have noticed, and this may be an issue also with the federal moratorium, that there seems to be a loophole in the state moratorium in that if there's a tenant who is up to date on their rent and they're not posing a health or safety risk, they're actually not covered by this moratorium. So if they have a minor lease violation, or maybe just the landlord has decided they want to raise the rent and they know this tenant can't afford it, and they're again just terminating the tenant with a 30-day notice of terminating their lease, they're not covered. Although there's still a prohibition in the state moratorium on law enforcement carrying out evictions, but they could still have an eviction filed against them. So that's a change we've asked Governor Pritzker and his staff to make to our state moratorium, and they said they would look at that. So obviously, we're going to be participating in the call-in day later this week, even though in Illinois, we have 2 Democratic senators and most of our congressional delegation is supportive. But just to remind them that we really do need more federal money for rent and mortgage relief as part of a COVID-19 relief package. And then I'll also point out one thing that we're very much experiencing in Illinois that other states and local governments are too, is really significant budget deficit. So for us, the Governor Pritzker has been talking about having to do across the board cuts to our state budgets, including for programs that provide housing and serve people who are homeless. So as part of that package, we really need robust funding to cover state and local government budget deficit. So we continue to look forward to working with the Low Income Housing Coalition on that. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bob. That's really sobering, some of the details of how many people applied, how many people have gotten assistance. Can you repeat that number for us? You said 80,000 people have applied for assistance, and how many received help?
Right, 80,000 applied. That was a completed application where the landlord filled out their part of the application. We don't have numbers yet on how many tenants wanted to apply, but they were not able to complete their application because their landlord didn't fulfill their part. But from that 80,000, only 30,000 households were able to be assisted, and they were assisted with a flat $5,000 grant to pay for rental arrears or rent payments going forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. And that trend that you're mentioning of landlords not filling out their part of the paperwork is something that we're hearing from other states too. So I'd be interested in hearing back from you when you've been able to do that analysis of, how sizable a problem with that in your state. I do have a question from folks wanting to know, how long does the Illinois state eviction moratorium last?
Well, I think like in many other states, our governor can do executive orders for 30 days at a time. So right now it goes through, I believe, December 12th. And we certainly will be advocating that he continue to extend it for as long as necessary. But certainly if we could get a strong federal eviction moratorium that didn't have these 30-day limits, that would be a major benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to put a larger point on it, for the 50,000 people who applied and completed their applications, but who did not receive help, was the reason because the state ran out of money, or were there other reasons why people were?
No, the state decided to do, and I think many other programs have done this, they did a lottery. So they had a deadline where people could apply until, and at that time they took all the completed applications and then selected 30,000 people. So, and there are local governments in Illinois, like the city of Chicago and suburban Cook County, and some of the collar counties in the Chicago metropolitan area that have done their own rent assistance programs using the federal coronavirus relief funds. We don't have data on all of those, but they also had many more people apply than they could fund. So for those people that didn't get rent assistance, they're now being referred to providers to see if any of them might be eligible for like the federal emergency solutions grants funds that are available to people who are at risk of homelessness. And there's also it's very extremely limited state homelessness prevention funding. But again, even with those additional resources, it's not coming close to meeting the need. And still in Illinois, we have many homeless service providers that move people out of shelters into hotels. And they have been able to move some of those people back into socially distanced homeless shelters or into their own housing. But in many communities, they still have those people in hotels. And so they really need the emergency solutions grants dollars to maintain those people in shelter or hotels and get them rehoused as well. So that's another reason why we need new rent assistance dollars. Hello, I'm not hearing anyone on the other side who I could go on, but probably Sarah wants to come back on, or somebody else from the National Coalition.
That was me. I guess I got kicked off and muted myself when I got back on. Thanks so much, Bob, for your update. And I was encouraging you to answer further questions in the chat box or the Q&A box. So appreciate you joining us.
Very good.
Now we're going to focus a little bit more on how folks on the line can be engaging with their members of Congress over the next several weeks, and to talk specifically about a national call-in day, which is this Thursday. I'm going to turn it over to Tori Beret from the National Income Housing Coalition, who can share more on that.
Thanks, Sarah. Appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I'm Tori Beret. I'm the Housing Advocacy Organizer at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Like Sarah mentioned, I wanted to let you all know that we are going to have our National Call-In Day this Thursday, November 19th, to demand that Congress immediately pass a coronavirus relief bill that includes essential housing resources and protections in the House passed HEROES Act. So like we heard on the call today, there's a huge concern. We have a huge concern that in about a month and a half or so, people are going to be out on the street, and not just some people. 30 to 40 million renters could be evicted from their homes on January 1st, which is very concerning. And you know, an eviction moratorium is great, but it's a stopgap measure. We also need to address the rental arrearages that have been building up. We need to make sure that people are all set in the future as well and can have their current rent paid for. So that's why it's really critical that we need Congress to act. They need to know the urgency of the situation. We also have some messaging. We're going to be putting out talking points, going into more details about the legislation, as well as posting a call-in script and an email that you can send to your members of Congress tomorrow. So we'll have that information available. A lot of the messaging we'll be talking about relates to the winter coming, as well as the holiday season, and it not being a time to evict millions of renters. No time is a good time, obviously, to evict millions of renters, but especially now when the cold season is coming upon us. So we're asking them to pass at least $100 billion in emergency rental assistance, a national uniform moratorium on evictions, $11.5 billion to prevent and respond to outbreaks among people experiencing homelessness, and at least $13 billion for HUD and USDA housing programs. So we hope you all will participate. We want to flood offices on Thursday and the remaining time that they're in DC. So I hope you all take 5-10 minutes and make some phone calls on Thursday.
Thanks so much, Tori. I do have a couple of questions for you. So in terms of who folks should reach out to, can you tell us a little bit more about which members of Congress folks should be prioritizing?
Sure. We'd love folks to prioritize their senators. We like the what's in the HEROES Act in terms of housing, which was passed by the House. And so the Senate can't agree on the numbers. So we really need you to call your senators and ask them to work with the House in determining determining a relief package, and especially getting numbers that reflect what's in the HEROES Act would be ideal. So if you want to focus on your senators, that would be wonderful.
Great, and I see folks that are asking, you had mentioned that you're putting together some, like an advocacy toolkit or a communications package. When can people expect to receive that, and what would be included in that?
Great. Yeah, so we're going to be sending one out tomorrow. It's going to include, so we're sending it to the email list, and we'll also have it available online on our under our COVID resources. It's going to include a background about the bill and what items we want included. It's going to have talking points depending on which sector you're from. We have health and housing and education and housing and different talking points geared towards different sectors. We'll have social media messages in there. We're going to have a call script, so you can use the script to make a quick phone call to your member of Congress. And I think those are the main parts of what we'll be including.
Great, and I see you sort of answered some of that question. Danielle asked about if we would have social media information online. Can you explain a little bit about why we decided not to do a Twitter storm for this event, but we're doing a call-in day instead?
Yes, we want the members of Congress to hear from you directly, and some of them do pay attention to their social media, but we want to really talk to, either have them or their staff talk to you directly and hear about what you're seeing on the ground, and hear about what the impact is and why they need to pass something. And it's just when you have a phone call or an email, there's more time to really get into the details and explain why all of this information or why rental assistance is critical, especially now. So that's why we're encouraging people to make calls. And it doesn't take, you can ask to speak to your member if they're not available, to their staff, and just ask for a few minutes of their time. You don't have to be on the call for very long. We want to get our main points across that we need a rental assistance funding as soon as possible. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I see a question from Julia about how to get on the distribution list for the call-in information campaign. And I'll just remind folks that we're going to share that information tomorrow with all NLIHC, anyone who's on our list. So they should get it tomorrow. We'll also have a special email that'll go out to folks who've registered for this webinar. So if you're on the webinar, on this call, you will receive an email that'll have a link to that, all the information that you need to make phone calls. I also see a question from Meredith who's asking whether and how congressional offices handle phone calls, and do they track those phone numbers? And they do. Typically what we see is members of Congress will keep track of zip codes and what issues people are calling about. That way they know where in their state they're hearing the most concern about, and how important of an issue it is. That's why it's so important to get folks from all across your state to participate and for them all to call in so that there's a record of numbers of how many people who are interested in this issue. And with that, let me see if there are any other questions that we have for Tori before we move on. I see somebody saying that they're going to prioritize Senator Collins. That's great. If you're from Maine, yes, you should prioritize her.
Thank you.
I think that's it. But Tori, if there are other questions in the chat box or the Q&A box, if you don't mind answering that for folks, that'd be great.
Great, will do. Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, and now I wanted to give an update about where things are on the Hill. I'm going to start with what we know for certain, which is that tomorrow the House is going to be voting on a package of disaster and coronavirus related bills. This is outside of pandemic relief, but it's still really important for folks to know about what's included. The bill includes, first, a major reform to FEMA programs to make it easier for low-income homeowners, low-income renters, people living in mobile homes to access FEMA assistance. What we've seen at least since 1995 is that FEMA has set very rigid documentation requirements requiring people to show title to their homes before they're able to get FEMA assistance. And of course, that's not accessible for people who have low incomes or people who are living in mobile homes or people who inherited their properties often. And as a result, we've seen tens of thousands of survivors who are eligible for FEMA assistance get denied. And so this bill is a bill that the Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition worked really closely with the committee on. It directs FEMA to broaden the scope of the different types of documents that survivors can use to prove that they own their home or that they reside in a disaster impacted area. We are trying to also make it easier for people who are experiencing homelessness to receive FEMA assistance, and this is a tool that would help them too. We're really happy to see that move forward, but we need to continue to put pressure on the Senate side to take up that bill as well, and we're hoping that we can see an opportunity to get that done before the lame duck is over. Another key piece of that bill is something that many of folks on this line would probably be very interested in. It would increase the federal cost share for disaster recovery and COVID-related costs. So this essentially means that the amount of state and local match would be much less. Typically, in a disaster, state and local governments would have to provide 25% cost matching. Under this bill, for any disaster that occurs in 2020, so any major disaster declaration, meaning the California wildfires, hurricanes, the derecho, et cetera, it would increase the federal cost share from 75% to at least 90%, which would hopefully reduce the burden on those state and local governments as they're trying to recover from those disasters. The second piece of that bill increases the federal cost share for COVID-related expenses to 100% federal cost share. That means that the state and local governments would not be required to provide any sort of match when it comes to FEMA PA funds that are being used to house people experiencing homelessness in hotels and motels, which would be a significant help in moving as many people as possible to safety. It also clarifies that the cost of establishing or operating shelters and providing services such as transportation that helps alleviate the need for people to use shelters, or costs incurred by private nonprofit organizations procuring or distributing food to individuals who are affected by the pandemic, are also eligible for FEMA PA funds and therefore would be at 100% federal cost share. So this is a really critical, important bill. We believe it will pass the House tomorrow, although there might be some votes against it, I think from much more conservative members of Congress. We do think it'll go through. Our job will then be to move it onto the Senate side to see if we can make some progress there. Okay, moving along. Let me see if there are any questions. Okay, I think I answered some of those questions. Moving along to the next update I wanted to give, I want to share a little bit about pandemic relief. As we mentioned before, the reason why we're having this National Call-In Day on Thursday is because we do see that there's an opportunity to get a bill passed in the lame duck. Though the size of the bill and the scope of the bill is unknown, which means that we advocates are really going to have to fight very hard to make sure that housing and homelessness resources are included in any sort of package that might move forward. We are still seeing that I don't believe negotiations have fully restarted, that we haven't heard of conversations yet between Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, but both have acknowledged that they want to get something done. I mentioned before on last week's call that McConnell is really taking over the lead for negotiations from Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. And so I think that's going to make it, there's going to be more pressure to have a smaller package, which means we have a lot of work cut out for us to make sure that housing and homelessness is in it. So I just want to reiterate what Tori had said. I want to make sure that folks participate in that National Call-In Day to the best that they can and encourage other partners that you work with to do the same thing. In terms of a spending bill, I just want to touch on this very briefly. Last week, we saw that the Senate Appropriations Committee released all 12 of its spending bills. We quickly dug into that bill to try to make sense of it. And from our reading of it, it seems like, for the most part, it provides modest increases to housing programs, despite really strict budget caps that are required by law. And so we're very appreciative of the leadership of Chair Susan Collins from Maine and Ranking Member Jack Reed from Rhode Island. They had a very tough task ahead of them and very limited funds, and they made sure that for the most part, housing programs got a little bump up from last year, and enough to make sure that all existing rental assistance contracts can be renewed. I'm going to ask a partner of ours, maybe Kim, if she can share a link to our analysis in our budget chart in the chat box for folks that are interested in that. Congress has until December 11th to reach a deal. It is still very possible that they're able to come to an agreement, especially because the numbers in the House and Senate bill are not too far apart from one another. There are some differences, and the House clearly goes above what the Senate provided. But there's still room for a possible agreement here. I think the bigger issue is a relief package tied to these spending bills, or do they pass by themselves? I will say there is some parts of the Senate bill that's pretty disappointing. It did not include any of the legislative language that was in the House bill that would hold back the administration from its very cruel and discriminatory policy changes, including changes to its the the proposed anti-transgender rule change to the equal access rule. It does not include any language stopping HUD from enforcing its mixed status immigration rule or from walking back HUD's changes to the affirmatively furthering for housing and disparate impact rules that go right to the heart of the ability for people to enforce their fair housing rights. So there are still some big differences between the two bills, but we're hoping to see something pass in a lame duck. And let's pause there for a second to see if I can answer any questions. Some folks have asked for the bill number or the name of the House bill that is going to be moving. The one that I mentioned on title issues is called the Housing Survivors of Major Disasters Act. I'm not sure of the bill name for the one that changes the cost share, but we will try to get that to you guys today and include it in our disaster update that goes out later this evening. And we'll make sure that we include bill numbers in that too. Appreciate your question on that. Okay, so those are the questions I'm going to be able to answer right now. The other thing I wanted to talk with folks about is our transition memo to the new administration coming in and to get your thoughts on it. I'm sharing the link right now in the chat box. Oh, I see Noah just shared the name of the other bill. It's called the FEMA Assistance Relief Act of 2020. That's the bill that increases the cost share for FEMA programs. So I'm including a link to our transition memo. I think we talked about it briefly last week, but I want to go over some of our day one recommendations to the new administration coming in and to get your feedback on what if other things we should be doing or if we should be thinking about this in a different way. So we've talked a lot on this call and in other calls about the tremendous risk ahead when the eviction moratorium issued by the CDC expires, and that we estimate somewhere between up to 30 million or 40 million renters could be at risk of losing their homes. So from our perspective, the number one action that this administration has to take on day one is to issue a new eviction moratorium. We're very worried that when the current one expires on the 31st of December, the new president doesn't come in until January 20th or 21st. That leaves about 3 weeks where all of these eviction filings that have been filed already by landlords could move forward. And I think Peter's analysis earlier on the call about what the risk is really apt right now, because we would see a huge number of landlords moving forward with eviction filings at that time. But there are some important changes that we're asking for the new administration to do in this eviction moratorium. One is to reduce the barriers that are preventing renters from being protected. We have mentioned many times on the call that one of the biggest challenges with this moratorium is that renters have to take an affirmative step to be protected. They have to fill out the declaration form, they have to sign it and give it to their landlords. And of course, many landlords are refusing to accept the declaration form. Some renters have trouble accessing printers. There's lots of challenges there. And so as a result, we're seeing people wrongfully evicted from their homes, even though they should be protected by this moratorium. So one of the things we're encouraging the Biden administration to do is to make this an automatic universal moratorium to keep renters in their home. And in that way, renters wouldn't have to take any affirmative steps in order to be covered. In the alternative, if the Biden administration decides that they want to keep in place the requirement that renters have to submit declarative statements, we're asking them to require landlords to first notify tenants about the eviction moratorium, to provide them with a copy of the declaration form, and to attest to courts that they have not received a declaration from renters before they're able to file for eviction. We think that will help stem some of the large problems that we've seen so far. The second reform that we're asking the Biden folks to do is to make sure that the moratorium applies to every stage of the eviction process. Again, Peter's presentation at the top of the call points to how important it is to stop the moratorium process, the eviction process, as soon in that process as possible, to suspend the ability to file for evictions in the first place. We think that's incredibly important, since we also know that when landlords file for eviction, many renters are intimidated into leaving their homes even before an eviction process can take place. Finally, we want them to provide greater clarity to courts and close some of the loopholes that have been brought up on this call. For example, we're asking them to make sure that the CDC moratorium covers no-fault evictions or evictions that might happen at the end of lease terms. That's something that we've heard directly from you all is really important, and we'll continue to push for that. We also want them to take back some language that was included in the most recent FAQ document put out by the CDC to make it clear that landlords cannot question the veracity of declarative statements signed by renters. We want to make sure that they are protected to the greatest extent possible. And finally, a major piece of this moratorium that needs to be fixed going forward is greater enforcement of those penalties against landlords who violate it. There is language currently in the CDC order that imposes time in jail and very expensive fines for landlords that violate the order, but so far we haven't seen any federal agency enforcing that. And so in the meantime, that means that landlords have been moving forward with illegal evictions without consequence. So we're encouraging the Biden folks to create a hotline number so that renters can use that to file complaints against their landlords who might be moving forward. And we ask them to charge the Department of Justice and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, among other agencies, to start enforcing this order with a really clear process that's published on all websites so that renters know how to stay in their home. Of course, that's just day one activities. We're also providing them with guidance about what they can be doing in the first 100 days. And this should be no surprise. We're really encouraging them to put a lot of their weight behind pushing Congress to reach a deal on a COVID relief package that includes robust resources for housing and homelessness. So I'm going to pause there and see if folks have questions about our transition memo to the Biden folks and the things that we're asking them to do in the first day and on the first 100 days. I see a question from William Higgins, who's asking whether or not we should be contacting the CDC to ask them to extend their moratorium. Yes, we are definitely doing that. We don't want to see any gap in protections for renters between when the CDC moratorium ends and when the Biden administration can take action. We've encouraged them to at least extend their moratorium and to fix the problems we've mentioned earlier through at least the end of March 2021, so that can give Congress and the new administration time to not only pass a bill that has relief, but to make sure that communities have time to get those resources out to renters. Just looking to see if there are other questions in here. I do see some folks are asking when we would like to see comments on the transition memo. I think anytime sooner rather than later is helpful, and you can feel free to email me. I'm going to ask Kim if she can share my email address in the chat box for folks. There is a question about providing help for small landlords, maybe landlords who have properties that are below 10 units. You know, this is something that we have been hearing about more and more. The longer that this pandemic continues, the more pressure is on housing providers. I will say that I think it's incredibly important for both renters and landlords to be pushing for emergency rental assistance, because we know that those resources help not only keep people in their home, but give landlords the rental income that they need to pay their property taxes or pay their vendors and to be able to continue to operate their properties. And so we see the emergency rental assistance proposal as helping, you know, all aspects of the housing industry and the housing continuum. Okay, I think that's all of the questions that we have time for today. I want to thank everybody for joining on the call and participating today. If you can, just another encouragement for you to participate in the National Call-In Day on Thursday. You should see that, you should note that we will be sending resources that you can use for your call-in day tomorrow, and we'll be sharing it with this group. So you should get an email in the next 24 hours with resources that you can use to call your senators and representatives. It's incredibly important, and we really thank you for all of your work over the last several months, and I hope that we'll keep it up for the next couple of weeks so we can get something done through the lame duck. And with that, I will give you 7 minutes of your time back, and thank you guys. Have a great afternoon.